Hi everyone, welcome back to the Thomasville Public Library's free poetry workshop classes. My name is Cody once again. If you missed our first video on haiku and blackout poetry, be sure to check out our Facebook page or the Davidson County Public Library's YouTube channel, and you can find it there. Today we're going to be talking specifically about free verse poetry, as well as doing a little intro to poetry itself and finding out what it is. So poetry kind of gets a bad rap from some people. A lot of people think that it's outdated, and I can tell you for sure that that is not the case. Just this year we had a 23-year-old poet perform both at the Super Bowl and at the presidential inauguration. So I can assure you poetry is very much in the times, very relevant just as much today as it ever has been. A lot of people think that poetry is a lot of rhymey, kind of lovey-dovey language that's very frivolous, or a lot of pretentious language that's very hard to read, impossible to understand. And I'm here to tell you that while some poems are that way, most are not, and not all poetry kind of falls into one of those camps. Another thing I should get out of the way rather early is that poetry is not just for one group. Poetry is not just for girls, not just for boys, not just for one ethnicity, not just for one nationality. Poetry is for everyone, and I can assure you that there are as many types of poetry out there as there are people out there. Poetry is a very diverse and ever-changing medium that has been around for about as long as the written language has. Poetry is also not always boring. If you're reading poetry that you think is boring, I'm just here to tell you you're reading the wrong poetry. There's all kinds of poetry, like I said, everything from traditional structured poetry to very avant-garde or very cutting-edge experimental poetry about all kinds of topics. So if there's something you like to read, we can find the poetry for you. Another thing people often think poetry is this coded message that you have to work to unlock. It's this puzzle that has a definite meaning that if you just sit there and stare at it long enough, you will figure it out. That's not the case for most poems. A lot of times, poems aren't necessarily meant to be figured out. It's more of an art, and like any art, it's supposed to give you a reaction, an emotional response. How does the poem make you feel versus what does the poem mean? Poetry, like I said, is an art form, and to my knowledge, it may be the only art form that is both audio, visual, and textual. Poetry is best enjoyed when it is heard aloud. So if you find that you don't like poetry, try reading it out loud or listening to YouTube videos of the poet reading their work. It's also visual. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But the way that poetry is broken up, line breaks, stanzas, things like that, it is a very visual art. And some poets even arrange their poetry in the patterns, pictures, things like that that associate with the poem itself. It is also a textual art. It is something that you read, something that the words themselves on the page create part of the art. And to my knowledge, no other art form can really accomplish that. Movies don't have the textual component. Plays don't have the textual component. Sculpture doesn't have the audio component or the textual. So it's a very unique art form. Poetry is the distillation of image and emotion. And what that means is poetry tries to take a very clear image and a clear feeling, put them together and compare them in a way that maybe you hadn't thought about before, and take out everything else. And that's really all a poem is comparing two things in a fresh way without anything else. Poetry is really about understanding what it means to be human, what it means to explore the world around us, lots of the deep conversational topics that really cut to the heart of who we are as a world. But like I said, not all poetry is necessarily like that. One of the first poems I ever wrote and really enjoyed was a poem about bacon. So not really a whole lot of deeper subtext there. It was just a poem about bacon. And then lastly, poetry is uniquely human. Researchers at Dartmouth College tried to automate poetry. They set up AI, artificial intelligence kind of robots, to try and recreate poetry. They had these bots consume just gigabytes and gigabytes of written poetry data from all throughout history and had them try to replicate it. They had a panel of judges sit down and try to determine which sonnets were written by robots and which ones were written by people. They caught the robots 100% of the time. So it's really nice to know that there's still something out there that can't be automated that is uniquely human. But we've talked quite a lot about it. Let's take a look at a poem. Before we do, there's a great video online. It's 5 minutes long from the TED Education on poetry. I recommend you watching that as well. We're not going to watch it here just because of time, but it's a great resource. So the poem we're going to look at right now is one of my favorites. It's by Billy Collins, and it's called Introduction to Poetry. Now, Billy Collins was the poet laureate for the United States of America, which means he was our national poet. I believe it was 2001 to 2003. Those dates might be off, but he was our national poet laureate. And he also taught poetry classes at the college level. And he wrote this about Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. This is a great poem. I love this poem. Like I mentioned before, and like Mr. Collins is saying here, poetry isn't about tying the poem to a chair and torturing a confession out of it. It's not about beating it with a hose to find out what the poem really means. It's about exploring it. It's about listening to the poem, seeing the poem, really enjoying it and feeling its colors and taking in the imagery that it's giving you. I found that for me, I never really enjoyed poetry until I started writing it in college. In high school and middle school, I always felt like it was very pretentious, it was boring, and I had to figure out what it meant. It wasn't until I stopped trying to figure out what it meant and just started to enjoy what the words were saying that I actually was able to find out what the poem meant, if that makes sense. I had to stop trying and just enjoy it, and that's when poetry, like my eyes were really open to it, and I started to enjoy it more. But now we're going to talk about free verse poetry. Poetry comes in as many different kinds and formats as you can think of. Many of them are very structured. I know if you saw our haiku class previously, they're very structured in terms of syllables and the number of lines. Free verse is just the opposite. We're going to take a look at the rules here. Rule number 1, there's no rhyme scheme. You don't have to worry about rhyming your lines or your words. If you want to throw a couple rhymes in there, sure, fine, why not? But free verse poetry itself does not rhyme. One less thing to worry about. Number 2, there's no set meter. Meter is the cadence of the words in your poem. Again, if you think back to the haiku, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. Some poems even talk about stresses, so no stress, stress, no stress, stress. With free verse, don't worry about it. Just write how you talk. And that's it. Those are all the rules. You have complete creative license to do really whatever you want with a free verse poem. It's very fun and very freeing as an artistic endeavor. Now here are some of the important elements to free verse poetry. We're going to talk a little bit about these more as we go, and honestly we could spend all day talking about the different parts of poems and the different things that make up poems, but we're just going to hit some of the high points. So we're going to look at a free verse poem. Now the poem we looked at previously, the Billy Collins, it was also free verse, but we're going to look at this one a little bit more in depth. We'd like to thank Miss Ricky Nelson for letting us use her poem. She was kind enough to let us really dig into her poem, and she is a graduate of the UNC Wilmington Creative Writing Program, and she's a local North Carolina poet. If you'd like to check out more of her writing, I encourage you to check out her writing blog. But let's take a look. This poem is called Today the Sun Set at 5:51 p.m. You look at a sunset and see beauty. I see a bruise formed by the pain of the day that fades into the purple of the night sky. I see a wound that will heal by morning. I see a soul too keen on second chances. I too am like a sunset, hurting, but hoping for a new beginning in the dusk to come. I am foolish. For the sun always sets, and your words always grip around me like a hand wrapping a wrist and pressing fingertips deep into a blue sky turned orange. You say I am beautiful. I say I am bruised. But like the sun, when morning comes, I rise. Now, I really like this poem a lot. It's got a lot of really cool things going for it. The first time I read it, I had to just stop after a minute and was like, oh wow, that affected me. Like, I really enjoyed the images that gave me and the way that the words kind of moved me, just like art is supposed to do. So let's take a look at some of the elements here. We're going to talk about stanzas, line break, imagery, and then just general language. So first let's talk about stanzas. Stanzas are just paragraphs in poetic form. You can see that we have a stanza here, here, and here. The poet, Ricky Nelson, has broken these thoughts up into 4 stanzas or 4 ideas that flow together. Separating them like this gives them a little bit more emphasis and a little bit more organization. You can have as many stanzas as you want. You can have one big stanza, however you'd like to write. Line breaks. So one of the cool things about free verse poetry is you can actually break up how the lines work to give your poem emphasis or organization. Now, there are 2 main ways that she has kind of done this with her poem. The ones in green are more organizational. Punctuation, you can see up here. Beauty, period, line break. Pain of day, that fades, period. So these are very much punctuation breaks. These is when you take a breath. Just the kind of the logical progression of when to break the line. Over here in the orange, you can see examples of when this has been done for emphasis. So in this case, the words either right before or right after, she wanted to emphasize in a special way. So for instance, I too am like a sunset, hurting but hoping for a new beginning. New beginning here is the focus of the sentence. It's what she's trying to convey. It's what the biggest emotional driver of this sentence is going to be. And so as a result, she just broke the line right there to where it's the first thing your eye sees when you go to it. Things that are first or last in an order typically have special significance to our brains. So in this case, new beginning is broken up to be emphasized. You can see more of that down here. For the sun always sets and your words always grip me. So here she's emphasizing that your words is what's gripping her, but also that they always grip. So if she had just left that up here, it would be fine, nothing wrong with that. But here she's emphasizing both that the words are what's gripping and that they always grip. And then sometimes it's a little bit of both. So you say I'm beautiful, I say I am bruised, but like the sun. So after bruised, that's when you would take a breath. That's kind of where a comma would be naturally. You say I am beautiful, I say I am bruised, but like with the sun. See, did you hear that break? But bruised is also a very emotionally charged word, a very image-based word. So she's emphasizing that there. You can also see 2 examples of when she used single short sentences for emphasis broken up on their own lines. A lot of really, really cool things Miss Nelson did with her line breaks in this poem. Next, we're going to start talking a little bit more about the language portion. If you'll remember earlier, I talked about poetry being the distillation of imagery and emotion. Imagery are words that evoke kind of what you can see on the page into your mind. So I have these written in this orange color: the sunset, bruise, purple of the night sky, hand wrapping and wrist pressing fingertips deep, blue sky turned to orange. All of these are very image-based language. It's very vivid. You can see it in your mind's eye. And then also metaphor. Metaphor is when you compare two things that you would not typically compare. So, for instance, the first thing she does is the sunset to hurt. You look at a sunset and see beauty. I see a bruise. The sunset is compared to a bruise. The purple of the night sky indicates both the transition from a sunset into the night sky and a bruise. When you get a bruise, it typically darkens and turns dark purple the longer you have it. She does this throughout with several different metaphors. The speaker to the sun. I too am like a sunset. And she talks more about that here. And then the words to a hand. Your words always grip me like a hand wrapping a wrist and pressing fingertips deep. Now, when you use like or as, the words like or as, in your comparison, it's called a simile, but it's still just a type of metaphor. There's no need to get all into the technical side of it. It's a comparison, which is the metaphor that we are speaking of. So all these things are really great ways that she's used language to make her poem really stand out, make it have an emotional response for the reader, and makes it a great poem. So we've talked a lot about what makes a poem. We talked about free verse, but now let's try writing one. Like I said, this for me is the most fun part, and the part where I really learned to enjoy and understand poetry better was through writing it. So here are 3 poetry prompts I have made for you. Number 1, write about a color using all the senses except sight. How does yellow taste? What does purple feel like against your skin? Can you smell green? Is it cut grass? Is it pollen? Is it something gross? Write about a color using all the senses except for sight, and see how better you understand that color. Number 2, compare your best friend to a specific place. The more specific the place, the better. And so by this I mean, instead of comparing your best friend to your house, compare your best friend to your bedroom, or the classroom where you first met. The more specific details you can pull in, the more kind of effective your metaphor will be, the better your imagery can be, because you won't be so general, it'll be more specific. Number 3, write about an event from the perspective of a non-living object. What did the trees think when the first men and women walked the earth? What did the rocks think when the first ship landed on American soil? What did the volcano think when it erupted onto Pompeii? A lot of really cool examples for you to kind of look at perspective in a different way and write metaphors that go beyond necessarily the human experience and put that into a non-living experience. It can be a really neat exercise. And then the bonus challenge, of course, would be to combine all 3 of these into one larger poem. I think that would make for a really cool poem. Speaking of writing poetry, free verse, and otherwise, we are hosting the Chair City Poetry Contest here in Thomasville, North Carolina, all throughout the month of April. Please feel free to submit. Free verse poetry, like we talked about, is one of the 2 types that we are accepting. You can either submit 2 haiku. Again, you can go back and look at our haiku video for that, or 1 free verse poem of 15 lines or fewer. Just go to tinyurl.com/chaircitypoetry and submit before April 30th. We're going to have the winners here in the library to do a live virtual reading. You're going to get a really cool prize basket courtesy of us, Thomasville Tourism, and our pals over at Thomasville Parks and Recreation, who are co-sponsoring the program with us. And we're also going to post your poem here in the library for people to read. So please check that out and feel free to submit poetry. If you have any sort of questions about the free verse poetry, the haiku, the poetry contest itself, feel free to give us a call here at the library, 336-474-2690, or stop in. We'd love to see you and say hi. But we look forward to reading your poetry, and thanks for stopping by.